Picture this. You wake up to the worst political headline you can imagine. The President of the United States has been caught using criminals to sabotage his opponents. And when investigators close in, he doesn't step down. He doesn't accept responsibility. Instead, he funnels hush money, leans on the intelligence community, and orders aides to block investigators. How would that change the way you view every election, every official, every speech? Would you still believe the system is honest? Would you still vote? How could an election be rigged? Say the question out loud, because asking it forces a clear look at the brittle places in a republic, where power concentrates, what safeguards exist, and what happens when a leader values victory over principle. That question is the thread that, in 1972, unraveled an American presidency. It is the question Watergate hurled back at the nation, and it is the same question that echoes through our politics today. On a humid night in June, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. They carried wiretaps, camera equipment, and cash. To the casual observer, it might have been a strange burglary. To those who would pull the thread, it became the first visible sign of something far darker. The burglars had connections to Nixon's re-election effort, and the trail of money and secrecy led inexorably toward the West Wing. That single bungled break-in did not topple a president. The cover-up did. The moral rot was not simply a covert operation. It was the willingness of the man in the Oval Office to shelter and enable it. Richard Nixon was a study in contradiction, brilliant and vindictive, strategic and insecure. He came from modest means, tasted bitter defeats, and returned to power with a fierce hunger to be respected and to win at all costs. He did not tolerate dissent. He learned to see enemies everywhere. That worldview birthed the Plumbers, an ostensibly defensive team meant to stop leaks that became a political dirty tricks squad. Under operatives like G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, the Plumbers engaged in break-ins, wiretaps, and sabotage. Their work was financed with secret money. And when the burglars were caught, the instinct at the center of power was not transparency, but concealment. The cover-up unfolded with a kind of cinematic malevolence. Payments were arranged to buy silence. False stories were fashioned. White House aides pressured the CIA to keep the FBI from following leads. On a tape that would later become infamous, Nixon spoke of cash as if it were routine campaign change. You could get $1 million, and you could get it in cash. I know where it could be gotten. Those words, recorded in the Oval Office, turned the whole enterprise from political gamesmanship into criminal obstruction. The act of hiding the crime became the crime. Journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein would not let the story die. With tips from a secret source, the man the public later knew as Deep Throat, they followed paper trails and bank records, stitched together memos and testimonies, and kept a spotlight on questions the powerful wanted to smother. Their reporting did not act alone. It dug into a landscape that would include prosecutors, judges, and an eventual Supreme Court that forced the release of tapes Nixon hoped would remain secret. When those tapes revealed his instructions to obstruct justice, the Republic watched in stunned silence as the section of a presidency thought untouchable was exposed. Nixon's response to exposure was as revealing as the tapes themselves. He compiled an enemies list, journalists, activists, politicians, and sought to use federal power to intimidate them. He demanded loyalty from subordinates in a way that substituted personal fealty for institutional responsibility. The crisis reached a fever pitch with the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon ordered the firing of the special prosecutor investigating the case. His attorney general and deputy attorney general resigned rather than carry out the order. The spectacle of a president attacking the Justice Department to shield himself was a moment of constitutional terror. When the so-called smoking gun tape was released, a recording from just days after the break-in, capturing Nixon and his chief aides discussing how to impede the FBI, the last political defenses collapsed. The House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment. Rather than face an almost certain removal, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. His closest aides would be convicted. The president himself would later be pardoned by his successor, a decision that left its own bitter legacy about accountability and consequence. But Watergate's damage was more than legal. It fractured a public's trust. The scandal also reminds us how fragile trust is. Once it's broken, it may never return. After Watergate, cynicism became the default. People no longer assumed leaders were honest. And in that cynicism, democracy itself grows weaker, because when citizens stop believing in the system, they stop participating in it. And that's when corruption wins. The betrayal was not only a political embarrassment, it was an erosion of the civic fabric. History would be incomplete if it stopped at the resignation. Watergate taught a brutal lesson. The danger is less often an isolated theft of ballots than a systematic corruption of institutions. Nixon did not stuff ballot boxes. He weaponized state resources, secreted campaign funds, and leaned on agencies that should have been neutral. That is what made the scandal so dangerous. It exposed how a president could turn the machinery of government into an instrument of self-preservation. That's a different species of threat than petty fraud. It is the co-option of the guardians of democracy. Which brings us to today. The tools have changed. The stage is entirely different. The age of tape recorders and paper cash has given way to digital platforms, encrypted messaging, data brokers, and financial webs that can shuttle money with the click of a mouse. Narrative power now travels at the speed of social feeds. Disinformation can be engineered and amplified across millions of screens in minutes. But while the methods have morphed, the fundamental dynamics are recognizable. A leader who sees enemies everywhere, who cultivates loyalty over competence, and who distrusts institutional constraints, will always test the republic in dangerous ways. When historians and journalists draw comparisons between Nixon and more recent presidents, they do so by mapping character patterns, the conspiratorial mindset, the personalization of power, the willingness to retaliate against critics. These are psychological and political affinities, not identical blueprints. Context matters. Nixon operated in a Cold War environment, in a less connected media landscape. Today's leaders navigate a 24/7 news cycle where every claim is amplified, where facts can be obscured by noise, and where the velocity of rumor can outpace correction. That makes for a different kind of risk. Faster, murkier, and harder to litigate in court. It is essential to be explicit about what you will not get here. This narration will not be an instruction manual. I will not enumerate tactics for subverting elections or suggest technical methods to target systems. That would be irresponsible and dangerous. What I will do is show, in stark terms, how vulnerability can arise. When institutions are weakened, when loyalty trumps competence, when money can be hidden and information can be weaponized. These are categories of risk, not tactical blueprints. The aim is defensive clarity, to show what must be guarded so that wrongdoing cannot flourish. So how likely is a repeat today? The short answer is, the risk exists, but the forms of that risk differ. In the narrow, cinematic sense, a small group physically breaking into a campaign office and placing wires, that sort of operation is less likely to be decisive in modern elections. The scales of oversight, forensic accounting, and digital records make some analog methods obsolete. But in the broader, systemic sense, the danger may be equal or greater. Leaders who denigrate independent institutions, who delegitimize election officials, who normalize allegations of fraud without evidence, who stack oversight roles with loyalists rather than qualified career officials, these approaches erode the bulwarks that held Nixon accountable. When the public no longer trusts the referees, the game cannot be fair. That erosion can be slow and incremental. It can begin with unverified claims that are repeated until belief replaces doubt. It can involve the strategic placement of allies in key bureaucratic roles, undermining the independence of prosecutors, inspectors general, and election administrators. It can involve funding networks that obscure donors and purpose. These are not romanticized heists. They are methods of attrition. In short, while a brazen, single-act coup is unlikely in a mature democracy with functioning institutions, A quieter strategy of institutional degradation, chipping away at norms and credibility, is an insidious risk that history shows can be devastating. If you doubt the plausibility, look at the catalog of red flags that tend to appear when leaders prioritize staying in power over governance. They attack the media, accusing reporters of bias. They label legitimate oversight as partisan persecution. They pressure or patronize independent agencies. They celebrate loyalty over expertise. Combine that with the modern machinery of disinformation and opaque money flows, and you have a cocktail that can corrode the routines that verify and legitimize election outcomes. The methods are different from 1972. The intent can be the same. And yet, there is reason for guarded optimism. Watergate also serves as a blueprint for defense. The thing that brought Nixon down was not a single hero, but a network of institutional actors doing their jobs. Dogged reporters who pursued truth, prosecutors who followed evidence without fear, judges who enforced subpoenas, and legislators who acted on facts rather than partisan loyalty. The Supreme Court asserted its role. Voters demanded accountability. These are the mechanisms of correction. Strengthen them, and the republic grows more resilient. What practical defenses matter? Not in procedural detail, but in principle. Robust protections for independent prosecutors and inspectors, transparent campaign finance rules that reduce shadow funding, secure, auditable election systems that produce verifiable trails, a free press that can investigate without reprisal, and a citizenry that values truth over tribal triumph. Those are the pillars that make it harder for a leader to bend the system. When these pillars are strong, no amount of secrecy or slush funds can mask malfeasance indefinitely. There is a moral dimension too. Power without humility is a lethal combination. Nixon's worst transgressions flowed from a mind haunted by defeat and defined by a desire for vengeance. That personality mix, insecurity coupled with absolute authority, is combustible. When leaders claim persecution while consolidating control, when they test every middle ground as weakness, they invite the very crisis they denounce. The safeguard against that lies not only in laws and audits, but in public culture, a commitment to norms, to the rule of law, and to the idea that public office is a trust, not a prize to be hoarded. Imagine the contemporary scene, not as a how-to, but as a diagnostic. What would alarm you? Persistent attacks on the credibility of nonpartisan administrators, a stream of unverified accusations amplified without correction, the erosion of independent oversight through appointments of cronies, sudden bursts of dark, untraceable funding that swamp local contests. Each by itself might be survivable. Together, they are dangerous because they erode the shared baseline of trust, the fact that citizens accept the results of elections because they're confident the process was fair. Watergate offers a final, sobering lesson. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires constant repair. It needs institutions that resist capture, journalists who persist against intimidation, courts that refuse to be tools of convenience, and citizens who demand evidence rather than slogans. The story of Nixon's fall is both a horror and a civic manual. Horror in what power can do when raw, and a manual in the sense that it shows which parts of the system must be preserved and reinforced. When you look into Watergate, you do not just see Richard Nixon, you see a nation's capacity for both awful misjudgment and corrective action. You see how fragile trust can be and how durable institutions, when defended, can redeem that fragility. You see the choices we still must make, whether to fortify the structures that keep power accountable or to let cynicism and partisanship erode them until the next scandal becomes the last. So ask again, not for instruction, but for vigilance. How could an election be rigged? Ask it so you remember the answers are not technical tricks, but failures of civic courage, the hollowing of institutions, the triumph of loyalty over law, the corrosion of truth. Ask it so you will support the guards, independent press, transparent financing, secure procedures, and a citizenry that refuses to accept dishonesty as the price of politics. Watergate ended with a resignation and convictions, with courts upholding subpoenas and journalists persisting despite danger. The modern moment will pass too, but only if we choose to defend the norms that let accountability work. The danger is real. The form it would take is different. The remedy is the same: vigilance, institutions, and people willing to put democracy above temporary advantage. Which future will we choose?